Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the podcast where we have conversations about the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, our general joy of being alive. And of course, we always talk about sustainable design as well. And to that end, I have one of our very first guests, and I'm really thrilled to have her back on the show again. Please welcome Vicki Worden from GBI. Vicki, it's a pleasure to have you back again on the show.
Oh, thanks so much, Joe. It's really great to be here with you.
Yeah, we had a great conversation last time, but this time we're going to be just a little bit more specific. We're going to talk about GBI's journey to net zero. Before we do that, and I know we've had you on the show before, Vicki, but I want to make sure that our listeners know our guests. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your background and the journey that brought you to being executive director for GBI?
Oh, I'm happy to. I have this year just come up on my 10th year as CEO of the Green Building Initiative, Inc. And so I'm excited about that. And we actually had our most exciting year, I guess, as our 20th year in operation, which was 2024. And had some of our biggest impact in the marketplace to date. So that was also exciting. But I started my career in policy and at the state and local level, and then worked my way into Washington, D.C. arena. I worked for a couple of different trade associations in Washington, D.C., right downtown next to the Capitol, and learned a lot about that intersection between business and the environment and federal policy. And so I was able to work in the building material industry for about a dozen years. And then I started my own business so that I could focus on sustainable development. And I had about 10 years as a consultant working for a number of different industries and federal agencies and international trade groups. And then my last 10 years here have been as CEO of GBI. And GBI kind of brings all those things together. We do a lot in the policy world and the advocacy world, and then just a lot of organizational development and in market building and doing good work on sustainable, healthy, resilient building issues.
Wonderful. I said executive director, forgive me, it's CEO. You mentioned 2024 being a great year, and I saw some numbers. I'm just going to read off some of them. Impact to date, 525 million kilobtu's in energy savings that can be tied directly to your work, 319% increases in on-site renewables, 46,000 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions avoided, and 75 buildings with no scope 1 emissions. Those are good numbers. That is something to brag about and something to be proud of. Did you want to expand on that before we go deeper into the standard itself?
Yeah, so there are a few different ways that the Green Building Initiative has a market impact. So we develop standards, we provide education based on those standards, and we also promote achievements. And so when we talk about impact, it usually centers on the number of buildings and building teams that we touch. And so for our whole building certification, Green Globes, this year we certified close to 600 buildings. And that was a huge accomplishment for us and one of our biggest impact years just with the whole building certification approach. But the numbers you're citing are actually from our program, which we launched in 2023, which is called the Journey to Net Zero. And that program is what we're going to talk about, I think, mostly today. And we were expecting when we launched it in July-ish of 2023 that we would have maybe a couple dozen buildings go through the pilot program. And what actually happened was we had over 170 buildings approach us to be in the pilot program.
Wow.
And out of those, about 154 buildings ended up being able to have the right utility data and allow us to compare apples to apples. And those are the ones that progressed through the pilot and helped achieve those numbers that you were citing in terms of demonstrated energy site EUI savings, as well as CO2 emissions reductions. And so our role as third party reviewers was really just to help document the achievements that were being made by all of these 154 buildings that succeeded on and progressing through our pilot.
It's just that one program. That's extraordinary. I was
Yeah.
looking at those numbers and saying, these are great numbers for, all of your programs.
Yeah.
But when it's just Journey to Net Zero, that makes the accomplishment even more substantial. Let's talk
Yeah.
more about, why the program was developed in the first place. I think big picture wise, we know, but let's
Sure.
talk specifically about the whys. And then let's talk about how you went about creating it and implementing it.
Yeah. Really great question. So we do a lot of traveling through Canada and through the United States, and we were talking to people about where they were on their journey to net zero, and building owners of all types and sizes, as well as organizations that try to help building owners. And one of the things that we learned kind of on our listening tour was that, first of all, there was a lot of confusion about policy that incentivized building owners to try to achieve either net zero energy or net zero carbon. And the confusion was that they had a goal for net zero carbon, but they were using carbon emissions as the metric, which they're not the same things, and vice versa. A goal for achieving net zero carbon emissions and then using site EUI. And there are a lot of building energy performance standards across the United States, and you see them in Canada as well. And you can actually see the confusion in the metrics there. So that was one of the things we found. The other thing we found is that building owners needed help with the math. There is actually, some complicated math that has to be done to determine, even with utility data, what portion of utility data is scope 1 emissions versus scope 2, and even sometimes scope 3. And so trying to help owners understand and then train the army of the rest of us who are out there trying to talk about net zero and really understand what it means. We knew that our program was going to need to provide an all-in-one approach. And so what we ended up doing was we created a program that had the opportunity to demonstrate both site EUI reduction as well as carbon emissions reductions with just one process. So we developed a beta Excel calculator we called the net zero calculator, and we used the greenhouse gas protocols to make sure we were using good sound science and math for how the calculations were done. We pulled actual utility data for the buildings that were in our pilot, and we ran it through the calculator, and we ended up being able to help these building owners demonstrate where they were. And the last thing I'll just say about when we were chatting with people, what we learned, we also learned that there is a lot of kind of pressure on building owners to get to net zero. But the reality that policymakers, that I guess there's a disconnect between the reality that it's going to take a while to get there, and so we have policymakers that are really excited about incentivizing and or, carrot or stick approach to getting building owners to net zero, but they're not recognizing that it's going to take time to get there. And so we have a 0 to 100% reduction arrow, so to speak, in our materials. And so building owners are able to show if they got to 75%, if they got to 50% reduction, if they got to 88% reduction. We created a scale that allowed them to demonstrate transparently where they are in their efforts. And that was also a big selling point for some of the larger REITs who are in very big cities that are on STEAM or gas, or, they just can't transition their buildings that fast. So they needed a way to tell their story. And that's kind of what we put together for our Journey to Net Zero program, was a way for them to do that.
Do you want to bring lots of healthy, beautiful natural light in your building and still meet energy codes? Try Solera from Advanced Glazings. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Okay, that's fantastic. You talked about math. All
Yeah.
right. You said the math is complicated and you guys provide some help. Can you explain, where the complexities in the math are and what you're providing in order to make it easier for folks to do that math?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing I'll say is that in part of relaunching our Journey to Net Zero program, which we did right at the beginning of 2025 this year, we had about an 18-month pilot with that 170, whittled down to 154 buildings. We were able to relaunch with our net zero calculator fully fledged as an interactive web-based platform. So the math that I talked about is much easier now for folks because they can put their utility data in. But basically, what we have to do with that math is pull utility data. If it's just one building, they might have 5 different meters, or they might have a number of fuel sources that they're tracking, on site. And so you have to really take a look at each building as a unique entity and try to figure out if, first of all, you have a 12-month period with all of the meters for that particular building. And then for existing buildings, we are comparing their progress on their current year against a baseline year. And we've got a little complication with that because we also had some bad data years with 2020 and 2021 with COVID.
Yeah.
And so a lot of our baseline years were around the 2018 mark. So we had to make sure we have apples to apples comparison, all the same meter data in the baseline year as the current year. And once you have that, then you need to have some formulas that help you interpret based on the fuel source and the location and all of those things, what combustion is happening on site, what is happening at the utility level, where they are with their emissions at the utility, because even if you're getting electricity from a utility, there are still emissions factors that are associated with that. So we needed a way to factor that in and then really just extrapolate to be able to show what the site EUI savings were and what the CO2 emissions savings were. So a lot of little steps in there that needed to be, again, matched up with the right protocols for looking at greenhouse gas emissions, and just made easier to go through that process of coming up with an end result. I could go on because, you've also got different units for each of those meters data that has to be converted. But at any rate, our process in our pilot figured all that out and made a tool called our Green Globe's Net Zero Calculator, just to make it super easy for folks.
So you've taken away the math altogether for them. You're handling it with your app and people are just providing the input data.
We did. And I would stress, though, that there's a lot of concern about net zero calculators, like online calculators, and it seems like it's a black box most of the time.
Right.
And people can't, third parties, aside from us, they can't evaluate the math being done by the calculator. And so I would just stress that our entire methodology is laid out, and folks can access the methodology on our website, thegbi.org. Click on the assessment area and Journey to Net Zero, and you can see a whole page with that information. And so we do try to be very transparent about that math and about how the calculator works.
Gotcha. Yes, it's not just trust me, this is the number. Yeah.
Right.
You can
No, you have to
Yeah.
have transparency. Yeah.
And you have the ability to verify. Okay, I like that a lot. I want to go back to the pilot. You talked a bit about the pilot, but let's do a deeper dive on it. Who was in the pilot? first of all,
Sure.
and then let's talk a little bit more about what you actually learned, because there was a lot there. I mean, it was a long time, 18 months, I think you said, and 154 buildings in the end. Like, that's a
Yes.
lot. So let's talk about, who were, what sort of demographic was represented by
Sure.
those, by all of those buildings, and what came of it? What were the
Sure.
learnings?
Our goal was to try to get a variety of building types in the pilot and to try to get buildings from every climate zone. And so we did get a majority of those goals met through our pilot. But I would definitely say that the largest proportion based on the portfolios that came to us were from the Class A office REIT segment of the market. They have a lot of demand on them in terms of being in very competitive environments. And we do have a supply versus demand issue with net zero buildings. So prior to the new administration in the United States, there was a specific goal for both leasing net zero space as well as creating their own net zero space at the federal level. And that is just an example. There are a lot of corporate organizations that are leasing space all the time, that are doing their own carbon accounting, and they want to be able to show that even in their leasing decisions, they are taking into consideration their carbon footprint. And so they want to be in low emission space. So Class A office REITs were a majority. We had very large portfolios that were part of the pilot, and we had an 80 building portfolio. We had a 50 building portfolio. We had a 13, 14 building portfolio that, made up a lot of that 154 buildings. And then we had a lot of individual buildings that were part of the pilot. So there was a lot of data to sort through. It was a lot to try to, parachute into each of those portfolios, data collection efforts, and analyze it. And we had to bring on board a lot of experts. And so we're happy to say that was one of the real benefits, I think, for the users, is that they had expert support at GBI. We had a team of staff that worked with each and every pilot participant. They received not only our analysis of their data so that they could see it in depth, how we did the analysis, and talk to us about, what we got right, what we might have made incorrect assumptions on, and then we came together in the end. And then we produced progress reports for each entity where every asset was analyzed as well as their portfolio overall. And those buildings that were able to demonstrate at least a 50% reduction in either site EUI or in carbon emissions were able to be what we call recognized in our program. And we had several actually that were able to be certified because of their use of renewables. They were able to demonstrate a 100% reduction with no combustion on site. And so they were able to earn what we call certified under the journey to net zero. So we have two different statuses.
Short lifespan single use plastic glazing is not a sustainable solution for daylighting. Solera is the glass based alternative for the new millennium. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Before we go on, I should have caught this earlier. Can you define EUI just for anybody who's not familiar with the
Oh,
term?
sure. Happy to do that. So the metrics that we talk about are energy use intensity. So site energy use intensity is EUI. And we also talk about CO2e, which is carbon dioxide equivalent. And that is kind of the way we talk about the combination of greenhouse gas emissions. And you can also compute that on an intensity basis.
Right. Okay. Now, changes from the pilot, like the original was released in 23 and you piloted it. What were the big consequential changes that were necessary from your learning?
Sure. Well, first of all, that great calculator I told you about, we had some flaws. We had
Of
some flaws in that, and it was really a great process to help us kind of go through and work out the kinks in our tools. We also realized that the buildings were coming to us not only from different regions across the country, but at different stages of their development. And so we needed to recognize that we had to have different pathways, just like we do for the Green Globe system. We always say one of the highlights of the Green Globe system is that we have multiple pathways and we have things that are allowed to be non-applicable so that you can use one system but not have a one size fits all for every building. In the case of Journey to Net Zero, we have a minimum energy efficiency requirement. And so we needed to recognize that not all buildings were going to be able to meet the same metric for minimum energy requirement. And a great example of that is that a lot of times we rely on energy modeling for new buildings based on, let's say, ASHRAE 90.1-2016 or ASHRAE 91-2019. And if you rely on that code, you are using an energy cost model to determine what your savings is. So you're doing a base building and then your actual building, you're showing a difference, and we want you to hit a certain number, show you're meeting a minimum energy efficiency requirement. Well, in buildings that are pursuing electrification, they're sometimes moving from a lower cost fuel, which could be natural gas, for instance, if they're in a natural gas market, to electrification where the electricity is going to be more expensive for them for a few years. So the energy cost model doesn't work. So we had to, through the pilot, figure out what all those different issues were and create different baseline opportunities for them. And so median EUI was one of the things that we added to the opportunity to be able to see what, or to be able to demonstrate compliance with a minimum energy efficiency requirement.
Gotcha.
That's just an example of what some of the things where we learned. But we did go through 3 different public input periods. We changed our definitions. One of the things that happened over the course of our launching the pilot to being about 2/3 of the way through was that the Biden-Harris administration decided that they were going to tackle coming out with a definition of zero emissions buildings. And they worked with the Department of Energy and all sorts of stakeholders. GBI was really involved in that process. And when they finished their process and published their zero emissions buildings definition, we aligned our certified level with that definition. And so that's another change that we made through the public input process.
Right on. Okay, let's change gears a little bit. What are you seeing on the policy front? And is, like, broadly speaking, I think you just gave us a nice little hint to it. Is policy embracing net zero?
Yeah, so policy is embracing net zero. And your listeners will probably remember 20 years ago when green building was new. Everybody was not new, but it was more popular. People were getting really excited and policy was spreading like wildfire across the country. Everybody wanted a green building policy. And so green building certification was written into policy for incentives, early permitting or tax incentives, things like that. We definitely still see that today where green building certification is leveraged in that way, but we're also seeing more policy around net zero. And a good example is the city of Chicago. They just did an update to their sustainability policy. And so GBI's Journey to Net Zero program has been written into their sustainability policy. So those that are pursuing development incentives using that policy can either benefit from our whole building certification, or now they can pursue the Journey to Net Zero and also get benefit and get points under that sustainability policy. On the national level, we're also seeing Journey to Net Zero or Net Zero programs be written into multifamily related incentives. So the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac market in the United States is one that helps to provide loans for, they tend to be more affordable multifamily developments, but sometimes just multifamily developments in general. And our Journey to Net Zero program has been written into Fannie Mae's side of that. They call it a green preferential pricing program. And so those owners who are pursuing highly energy efficient buildings or low emissions buildings are able to get significant discounts on their loan vehicle over the period of time if they are able to demonstrate certification. And then the last thing I would say is that, again, under the Biden-Harris administration, there was a leasing task group that was developing an advice letter for the private sector. And in that advice letter, they included several net zero programs as opportunities for the private sector, and our Journey to Net Zero program was referenced there too.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, so what's next for the program? Where are we going, Vicki? The near future hold for us?
Yeah, I think it's exciting. There's still a significant amount of excitement around the program. We have submitted it for recognition through GRESB, which is the global ESG benchmark. So a lot of the REITs that we work with are still using GRESB as a way to show their rank amongst their peers and to compete for investor funding. And so having our Journey to Net Zero program approved and recognized by GRESB should provide additional value for the REITs who are using it. We are working on training consultants. So we have a Green Globes professional designation and a Green Globes emerging professional designation. So we'll be offering Journey to Net Zero training to those who hold those credentials, as well as incorporating training for those who are just now earning them. And then we are open for new registrants. The program is extremely affordable. We know that most of the building owners that pursue it are also going to be pursuing a green building certification. And they also do GRESB and they do reporting out all different ways. And so we wanted to keep the cost of this program as minimal as possible. And so any building owner can register a building for $1,500, and the smallest buildings will not cost any more than $2,500 to get our Journey to Net Zero evaluation. And the largest buildings will not have fees above $6,000 total. And that's including the registration fee. So this is designed to be a volume program. It's designed to have entire portfolios run through the program so that we can help them on an annual basis, but at least every 3 years. So if someone jumps into the program and gets an evaluation, we say that evaluation expires after 3 years and they need to come back and have it reassessed. So that's kind of where we are with it.
Those are very reasonable costs. I love those numbers. Let's talk about the portfolio. I'm sorry, I got to go just on a little bit of a deeper dive. So let's say somebody owns a portfolio of 10 buildings, one owner. Is it a scenario where, some percentage of those buildings, 5 of those buildings are above standard and some of them are below standard, and they can trade off for the whole portfolio, or does each building need to meet requirements individually?
We certainly will make discounts available for portfolios. They just need to contact us and we'll work out discounts on that so that they, have as reasonable an approach as possible. But because you have to evaluate each asset and there's no way to do an entire portfolio without looking at the utility data specifically for each asset, it is a per asset fee in the end, but we certainly would do volume discounts and help portfolio owners as much as we can with that.
So besides the fees, what about the actual performance? So let's say one building is
Oh,
exceeding requirements. No, I'm glad you answered the question about the fees as well, because that matters a whole lot.
yeah.
But let's talk performance too. So let's a portfolio of 10 buildings. Several of those buildings are, let's say, have exceeded requirements, and maybe one or two of them haven't. Is there a scenario where you look at the entire portfolio as a whole, or do you need to meet requirements for each individual building
Yeah, no,
performance wise?
I appreciate that. And I didn't pick that up with your original question. And the answer to that is that each asset is evaluated on our 0 to 100 scale.
Okay.
So the reality is that in a 80 building portfolio or a 50 building portfolio, we found that only about, I think it was 6.7% of all of the buildings that we evaluated were applying renewables against their utility structures and basis. And so it's going to be a smaller percentage of buildings that actually achieve the 50% minimum requirement for recognized, and a much smaller percent that achieve the 100%. And so what we have done is demonstrate through our progress report which buildings are at each level, either certified or recognized, what the specific percent reduction is they achieved, which metrics were used, and then the rest of the buildings, they were able to see where they were under that 50% mark. So we did have a third terminology called emerging. And so we're not using that as much now because it's easier really just to have two levels that folks are achieving. But the majority of those buildings are in progress to get to net zero, and we were able to help them demonstrate where they were. I would say that, a couple other added benefits came from those who participated in the pilot. It was, I think, unique for a lot of them to look at their procurement decision making and recognize that with net zero incentives and the market viability of being able to decide to pursue net zero on a specific building based on the ability to have more competitive leasing, like that wasn't necessarily something that they were all putting together. And so, having gone through this program, I think they're looking at their portfolios differently and thinking about procurement from the standpoint of how do I match up my buildings that are closest to achieving net zero with a procurement and a capital investment strategy that will help us to get there faster so that we can take advantage of leasing opportunities. And so I think we really help folks evaluate their procurement strategy. We help them also evaluate where they were with refrigerants and emissions and tracking. A lot of them are not creating inventories of their refrigerants now. And so I think there were a lot of really good value adds for those who went through our program.
Oh, fantastic. All right. So the Journey to Net Zero program, truly amazing. The tools associated with the program are very exciting to me. What else is happening? Is there anything else coming from GBI these days or in the near future, Vicki?
Yeah, we're definitely excited about some new programs we have. We're also seeing policy, first of all, on data centers. I wanted to throw in there. Data centers are a really big area for GBI right now. We're doing a lot of support for data centers in the achievement of their sustainability objectives. We are working collaboratively with them in their conversations at the community level to help them make sure that the communities understand that they're partnering with a sustainability organization and that we're working together to ensure that their objectives, the community's objectives, are met, as well as the data center sustainability objectives. And that's actually resulting in legislation we're seeing at the state level in the United States. I'm not sure if we're seeing it yet in Canada, but we're seeing tax incentives come through for data centers that are pursuing certification within 3 years of becoming operational. So that's exciting. We're also seeing resilience policy come through. So in territories mostly that are impacted by coastal issues, but some that are impacted by other climate related issues, we're seeing policy pop up where legislators are interested in making sure that buildings that are getting state funding, for instance, are pursuing resilience measures. And so we developed a Green Globe's distinction in resilience. And that's like an extra layer of minimum requirements that focus on resilience criteria. We have a similar one that launched 2 years ago for health and wellness. And so again, it's an extra minimum layer of minimum requirements. And so those are complementary to the Journey to Net Zero program. So you can mix and match what you want to pursue based on what your stakeholders are interested in. But I think it's just really helpful to always remember that third-party review, third-party certification holds everybody's feet to the fire, and it makes sure that value translates in the end, and what we specified gets in the building, and we're there to be those reviewers to give everyone some level of assurance that what is being delivered is what was agreed upon.
Fantastic. Look, at some point in the near future, I want to do an entire episode just on data centers, just given the explosive growth in AI and what that's doing for, the energy consumption required to support AI. This is a really important topic, and I think it probably deserves at least an episode. And we'll talk about that offline, but I definitely want to do that in the near future.
I'd have to agree.
Yeah, that's a conversation that needs to be had fairly soon. So, Vicki, before you go, and I know you've answered my $1 million question in the past, but I'm going to ask you again. I ask this question at every episode, and I ask my guests to answer from whatever perspective that they see fit. What makes a great building?
What makes a great building? Is that the question?
That's
Did I hear
the question.
Right? Okay.
Yep.
What makes a great building? I think a great building comes into play, and I think I did answer this before. I'm going to give you a different answer this time, but a great building comes into play when you set performance goals at the beginning of your process. You use an integrated design process to make sure that those performance goals carry all the way through. And then you have third-party certification at the end so that you've followed the roadmap, you've applied the right lens of sustainable, healthy, resilient, all the way through your decision making. And then, you have a third party come in and verify your results. So I think that always makes a great building.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, it was a pleasure to get to speak to you again. I will hopefully see you next month in Halifax. I'm really looking forward to that.
Same.
And it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for coming again.
Thanks, Joe. It's always great. I love coming in and chatting with you. So thanks for the invite.
For sure. You take care.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.